The night it all started felt so ordinary, it was almost insulting in hindsight. I sat in my home office, my fingers moving automatically over the keyboard, though my mind wasn't fully in it. The mug next to me, a Father's Day gift from Ethan, still had traces of morning coffee clinging to the rim. My wife Vanessa had bought it for him to give me, though now that I thought about it, the gesture seemed more hers than his. It was late, and the house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs as the kids turned in their sleep. Vanessa had gone to bed hours ago, or so I thought, until her laugh floated through the window. I froze mid-typing. It was her laugh, the soft, familiar sound that had once been my favorite thing about her. But hearing it outside, at this hour, wasn't right. I leaned back in my chair, listening more closely. A breeze carried her voice, clear and lilting, followed by something else, words that didn't belong. "He still doesn't have a clue," she said, her tone edged with amusement. 3 kids, and he's so sure they're his. The room spun for a moment, the air pressing against my chest like a weight. My hands were trembling as I pushed away from the desk and moved to the window. I didn't even know why. Maybe part of me still believed I'd misheard, or that there was some reasonable explanation. But when I looked outside, there she was. Vanessa stood in the garden, her phone pressed to her ear, pacing in slow, deliberate steps. The way she smiled, as though she were sharing some private joke, made my stomach churn. Her voice came again, this time quieter, but the breeze carried enough of it. "Next weekend works. I'll say it's another late shift." A pause, and then a soft laugh. "You always know how to make me feel better, Eric." Eric. That name hit me like a brick. Eric was supposed to be my best friend. He'd been there for everything, the kids' baptisms, birthday parties, weekend barbecues. He'd even helped me set up the deck last summer, making jokes about how I was all thumbs with a hammer. The thought of him on the other end of that phone call made my chest burn. Vanessa turned toward the house, and I moved back quickly, retreating into the shadows of my office. She walked inside moments later, her robe brushing against the floor as she passed the doorway. "Still working?" she asked, her tone casual, maybe even affectionate. If I hadn't heard her outside, I might have believed it. "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. I forced myself to smile at her, though I could feel my face strain under the effort. "Just wrapping up?" "Don't stay up too late," she said, flashing a tired smile before heading upstairs. The sound of her footsteps faded, but I stayed frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman I'd known for 15 years with the one who had just whispered her secrets into the night. For hours, I sat in that chair, staring blankly at my computer screen. The code I'd been working on earlier blurred into meaningless lines. Everything felt hollow, every memory, every shared laugh, every quiet moment we'd spent raising our kids. My kids. I thought about Ethan's quick wit, Hannah's fiery temper, and Oliver's quiet brilliance with puzzles. Did they even belong to me? I wanted to march upstairs and confront Vanessa right then, demand the truth, shout until her lies unraveled under the weight of my anger. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was a need for certainty. Or maybe it was the kids, sleeping soundly just down the hall, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change. Instead, I opened my browser and searched for Eric. It wasn't hard to find him. Social media posts, professional profiles, pictures with his wife and kids. His life looked polished and untouchable. My hand hovered over the mouse as I stared at his family photo, taken just last Christmas. I felt sick. When I couldn't look anymore, I shut the laptop and leaned back in my chair. My gaze drifted to the mug on my desk, the one that read "World's Best Dad." The words suddenly felt mocking, like a cruel joke I wasn't in on. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront Vanessa. Not yet. Whatever this was, however far it went, I needed proof. I needed to know how deep the betrayal ran before I decided what to do about it. The next day, after Vanessa left for work, I made a call. It was to an old friend who had gone through a bitter divorce a few years back. He'd once mentioned hiring a private investigator, and I remembered the name. That's how I found Greg, a no-nonsense man with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel. "Tell me everything," he said when we met later that week. I did. I told him about the phone call, the late-night whispers, and the way her laugh had sounded too familiar for comfort. As I spoke, his expression didn't change, though he scribbled notes with quiet intensity. "If there's something to find," he said when I finished, "I'll find it. But be prepared. These things don't stay clean." His words lingered with me long after we parted. Deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to be clean. Greg worked fast. Within days, he started feeding me updates that turned my quiet suspicions into a roaring certainty. His emails were clinical, full of dates, times, and attached photos that felt like punches to the gut. There was Vanessa, sitting across from Eric at a downtown cafe, leaning in too close, her hand brushing his. Another photo showed her car parked outside the familiar lake house my mother had always favored, Eric's truck parked right beside it. Every piece of evidence Greg uncovered made it harder to hold myself together. At home, I played the role of the oblivious husband to perfection. Vanessa kept up her routine, flashing her practiced smile, humming as she cooked dinner. If she sensed my growing distance, she didn't let it show. Maybe she thought I was too blind to see it. One night, after the kids were asleep, she leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping a glass of wine. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice light, almost teasing. "Everything okay at work?" I looked up from the plate I was washing, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, just busy." She nodded, accepting the answer easily. Why wouldn't she? She'd spent years perfecting the art of looking me in the eye and lying. That realization sent a wave of nausea through me, but I swallowed it down. Not yet. Later that night, I reviewed the latest batch of evidence Greg had sent. This time, it included text logs from a burner phone Vanessa had been using. Messages between her and Eric were as explicit as they were infuriating. "Vanessa, last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. Eric, you looked incredible. Next time, I'll make sure we have the whole weekend. Vanessa, can't wait. He's working late again tomorrow, so maybe I can sneak away." I closed the laptop, my fists clenching. Every part of me wanted to confront her, to throw her lies in her face and demand an explanation. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. There was more to consider than just my anger. The kids, the house, everything I'd spent years building. The next morning, I called Greg. "I need you to dig deeper," I said, pacing my office. "Bank accounts, anything financial. I want to know how far this goes." "Already on it," Greg replied. "I'll send you what I find." The days dragged by, each one heavier than the last. At work, I buried myself in projects, grateful for the distraction. At home, I focused on the kids. Ethan had a big soccer game coming up, and Hannah was preparing for a school play. Oliver, always the quiet one, had taken to building elaborate structures out of Legos in the living room. They were my anchor, the only thing keeping me from breaking under the weight of it all. One evening, while helping Ethan practice soccer drills in the yard, he stopped and looked up at me, his face serious. "Do you think Uncle Eric will come to the game?" he asked. The question hit harder than I expected. "I don't know, buddy," I said carefully, forcing a neutral tone. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, kicking the ball absent-mindedly. "He always gives the best tips. Better than coach." I nodded, though my chest burned. "I'll be there," I said, ruffling his hair. "We'll win this one together." That night, Greg sent me the financial records. They were worse than I imagined. Vanessa and Eric had been funneling money through hidden accounts for years. My money. There were transfers I didn't remember authorizing, withdrawals Vanessa had disguised as household expenses. Even more damning, there were plans for a joint account, complete with future deposits labeled as escape fund. Greg's voice was grim when we spoke the next day. "This isn't just an affair," he said. "They've been planning their exit strategy for a long time. If you hadn't caught on, they could have walked away with a good chunk of your assets." I thanked him, though the words felt hollow. Everything I'd worked for, every ounce of trust I'd given Vanessa, was now a weapon she was using against me, but not for much longer. The breaking point came a few days later. Vanessa left for what she claimed was a late shift at the hospital, but the tracker Greg had placed on her car told a different story. She drove straight to the lake house. By the time she arrived, Eric's truck was already there. I stared at the screen, watching the little blinking that marked her location. I thought of the kids upstairs, of all the lies that had built our life together, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to act. I called my lawyer, Nora Whitaker, who had been quietly working with me for weeks. She was sharp, relentless, and had a reputation for dismantling cases like this with surgical precision. "It's time," I said simply. "Good," she replied. "Everything's ready. Do you want me to file immediately?" "Not yet," I said. "There's one last thing I need to do." Vanessa thought she was in control. She thought her lies had kept her safe. But she was wrong. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back the life she thought she could steal from me. And I was ready. Vanessa returned home late that night, wearing the same silk scarf I'd seen her put on earlier in the day. It fluttered slightly as she stepped through the door, her movements light and breezy, as if she hadn't just spent the evening at the lake house. She smiled at me, the same smile that once felt warm but now felt hollow. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her bag down on the counter. "Long shift. So much paperwork." I nodded, pretending to be engrossed in my laptop. "No worries," I replied, keeping my voice even. Her smile faltered for a second, maybe because I didn't meet her eyes, but she didn't press. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and disappeared upstairs. I waited until the house was quiet before opening the folder Greg had given me earlier that day. Inside were new photos, financial records, and one damning detail I hadn't expected. Eric wasn't just planning their future together. He'd been moving assets into private accounts for months, accounts Vanessa likely didn't even know about. I stared at the evidence, feeling a sick satisfaction. Eric wasn't just a liar and a cheat. He was also playing Vanessa. The thought would have made me laugh if it didn't also make me furious. I'd spent years trusting both of them, and they had turned my life into a game. But now, I was flipping the board. The next morning, I sent the kids off to school as usual. Ethan left first, running late as always, while Hannah lingered at the breakfast table, scribbling last-minute notes on her math homework. Oliver, clutching his latest Lego masterpiece, asked if I'd help him build something bigger after dinner. "Of course," I told him, ruffling his hair. "We'll make the best one yet." Once they were gone, I set my plan in motion. My first call was to Rachel, Eric's wife. She picked up on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Mark," she said, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you again so soon." "I thought you'd like an update," I replied. "Things are moving quickly now. Have you decided what you're going to do?" There was a pause on her end. "I've spoken to my lawyer," she said finally. "Eric has no idea, but I'm filing next week. I'm taking the house and the kids. He won't see it coming." "Good," I said. "Keep him off balance. The less he knows, the better." "And Vanessa?" Rachel asked. "She'll find out soon enough," I said. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Rachel and I weren't exactly allies. We were two people navigating the same wreckage, trying to salvage what we could. But knowing she was taking steps to protect herself gave me a small measure of comfort. The rest of the day was a blur of calls and preparations. Nora finalized the paperwork for the divorce filing, ensuring everything was airtight. She double-checked that Vanessa wouldn't have access to the kids' trust funds, even in the event of a custody dispute. "It's all set," Nora said during our last call of the day. "She won't have a leg to stand on once this goes public." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Good," I said. "Make sure everything is ready. Tomorrow, we start." The following evening, Vanessa and I sat at the dinner table with the kids. Ethan was excited about his upcoming soccer game, chattering nonstop about strategy. Hannah rolled her eyes at his enthusiasm, but there was a small smile on her face as she teased him. Oliver, as usual, was quiet, focused on balancing a fork on the edge of his plate. Vanessa seemed distracted, her phone lighting up repeatedly with notifications she quickly swiped away. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, noting the way her hand shook slightly as she reached for her glass. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked up, startled. "What?" "Oh yeah, just tired." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but I saw the unease in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how much. After the kids were in bed, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the living room, waiting. Vanessa joined me a few minutes later, tucking her legs under her as she sat on the opposite end of the couch. "Mark," she said, her voice hesitant, "is everything okay? You've been distant lately." I swirled the amber liquid in my glass, watching the light catch the edges. "Just a lot on my mind," I said. She shifted uncomfortably. "You can talk to me, you know." I looked at her then, really looked at her. The woman I had loved for 15 years, the mother of my children, the person who had turned my life into a lie. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. "Can I?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely scared. "What's that supposed to mean?" I set my glass down on the coffee table and leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. "I think you know exactly what it means," I said. The color drained from her face, and her breath hitched. "Mark." I stood, towering over her as she shrank back into the couch. "I know everything, Vanessa," I said, my voice cold. "The texts, the lake house, the money, you and Eric. I know it all." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I can explain." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your lies. This ends now." Vanessa buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit alone with the weight of what she'd done. Tomorrow, the paperwork would be filed. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. But tonight, I let her sit in silence, knowing that her perfect little world was already starting to crumble. The next morning felt strangely calm. Vanessa avoided me entirely, slipping out of the house before I even came downstairs. I could hear the muffled sound of her voice carrying through the thin walls as she whispered into her phone, likely trying to salvage whatever she and Eric had left. I didn't care. She was past the point of damage control. After she left, I got the kids ready for school, the routine almost soothing. Ethan talked nonstop about his soccer game, asking if I could help him practice after dinner. Hannah grumbled about her math test but lit up when I reminded her about her upcoming recital. Oliver tugged at my sleeve, showing me the latest addition to his Lego city. For a moment, I forgot about everything else. But once they were out the door, reality came crashing back. I spent the morning reviewing the finalized paperwork Nora had sent over. The divorce filing was brutal but precise, leaving no room for Vanessa to maneuver. She wouldn't have access to the trust funds, the house, or any significant portion of our assets. Nora had made sure of that. Around midday, Rachel called. Her voice was steadier than the last time we spoke, her resolve solidifying with each passing day. "He's been trying to reach me," she said without preamble. "Texts, calls, he even showed up at my office." "Let him squirm," I replied. "He's probably starting to realize how bad it's about to get." Rachel hesitated. "Do you think Vanessa knows about the money? About what he's been hiding from her?" I leaned back in my chair, considering it. "No," I said finally. "If she did, she wouldn't look so rattled. He's been playing her just as much as he's been playing you." She let out a bitter laugh. "Well, at least we're not the only ones he's lied to." After hanging up, I sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything pressing down on me. It wasn't just Vanessa and Eric's betrayal that stung. It was the ripple effect it had on everyone around us. The kids, Rachel, even Evelyn. None of us were walking away from this unscathed. By late afternoon, I got a notification from Greg. He'd sent over the final piece of evidence, a detailed report on Eric's financial transfers. It was worse than I thought. Not only had he been siphoning money from their accounts, but he'd also been setting up a contingency plan to leave Vanessa behind. There were flight reservations, hotel bookings, and even a deposit on an apartment in another state. Eric was planning to disappear, and he wasn't taking her with him. The irony made me laugh, though it wasn't a pleasant sound. Vanessa had spent years lying to me, building a future with Eric behind my back. And now, he was about to do the same to her. I decided it was time for the next step. That evening, after dinner, I called the kids into the living room. Vanessa wasn't home yet, Another emergency shift, no doubt. And I knew this conversation couldn't wait much longer. Ethan flopped onto the couch, still in his soccer jersey, while Hannah sat cross-legged on the floor, scrolling through her phone. Oliver climbed onto my lap, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. "What's up, Dad?" Ethan asked, his tone casual. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "There's something I need to talk to you about," I said carefully. "Something about your mom and me." Hannah looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing. "Are you guys okay?" I forced a small smile. "We're going to be, but things are going to change. Your mom and we're separating." The room went silent. Ethan's mouth fell open, his expression shifting from shock to confusion. Hannah's face tightened, her eyes narrowing as she processed what I'd said. Oliver, still too young to fully understand, just tilted his head, his little fingers gripping my sleeve. "What do you mean, separating?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. "Like a divorce?" I nodded. "Yes. But listen, this doesn't change how much we love you. Both of us. You're still the most important thing to us, and that will never change." Hannah's face crumpled, and she turned away, wiping at her eyes. Ethan stared at me, his expression a mix of betrayal and anger. "Why?" he demanded. "What happened?" I swallowed hard, struggling to keep my voice steady. Sometimes grown-ups, they don't see things the same way anymore. But it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This is crap," he shouted. "You're supposed to stay together. You're supposed to." "Ethan," I said sharply, cutting him off. He froze, glaring at me with tears in his eyes. "I know this is hard. I know you're angry. And that's okay. But this isn't something we can change." He didn't respond, just stormed out of the room and up the stairs, slamming his door behind him. Hannah followed quietly, leaving me alone with Oliver. "Are you sad, Daddy?" Oliver asked softly, his wide eyes looking up at me. I pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his hair. "A little," I admitted. "But I'll be okay. And so will you." When Vanessa came home later that night, I was waiting for her in the living room. She looked tired, her makeup smudged and her shoulders slumped. "We need to talk," I said before she could say anything. She hesitated, glancing toward the stairs where the kids were asleep. "Can it wait?" she asked. "No," I replied firmly. "It can't." She sat down, and for the first time in weeks, she looked at me with something resembling fear. "I know about Eric," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "I know about the money, the lake house, the texts. I know everything." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Save it," I said. "The divorce papers are already prepared. You'll be served tomorrow." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. "Mark, wait." "There's nothing to wait for," I said, standing. "You've already made your choices. Now, you'll deal with the consequences." I left her sitting there, stunned into silence, and went upstairs to check on the kids. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for the first time in months, I felt a small measure of peace. The worst was behind me. Now, it was time to rebuild. Vanessa didn't leave quietly. The next morning, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers I had laid out for her. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, pausing at the sections outlining custody arrangements and the financial terms. When she reached the clause about the kids' trust funds being untouchable, she looked up at me, her eyes full of anger. "This is absurd," she hissed. "You're punishing me, Mark. For what? For making a mistake?" "A mistake?" I replied, my voice cold. 15 years of lies and betrayal isn't a mistake, Vanessa. It's a choice. Repeated. Over and over. Her face flushed, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then she sighed and slumped back in her chair. "What about the kids?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "You can't do this to them." "I'm not the one who did this to them," I said evenly. "But I'm the one cleaning it up. They'll be fine. They'll have everything they need. Stability, love, and honesty. Things you decided weren't important." Vanessa's gaze dropped, and she said nothing more. By the end of the week, she moved out. The kids took it hard, especially Ethan, who had barely spoken to me since our conversation in the living room. He blamed me, of course, and I couldn't entirely fault him for it. In his eyes, I was the one tearing the family apart. Hannah avoided me as much as possible, throwing herself into her schoolwork and soccer practices. Oliver, too young to understand the full picture, clung to me more than ever, his wide, questioning eyes breaking my heart every time he asked when Mommy was coming home. Vanessa rented a small apartment across town. I made sure the kids had a room there, but they were staying with me full-time, as outlined in the agreement she reluctantly signed. She came by a few times a week to see them, always careful to keep her visits short. Our interactions were limited to strained hellos and goodbyes, both of us avoiding any unnecessary conversation. Eric, predictably, disappeared. Rachel had blindsided him with her own divorce filing, taking the house and their savings. Greg's final update revealed that Eric's so-called escape plan had backfired spectacularly. He tried to pull money from one of his hidden accounts, only to find that Rachel's lawyer had frozen everything. The apartment he'd been preparing for his new life with Vanessa? Gone. His job? Terminated once his affair became public knowledge. The last I heard, he was staying with a friend in another state, trying to scrape together enough to start over. Rachel and I met for coffee a week after everything settled. She looked different, calmer, stronger. Her sharp wit, once dulled by years of Eric's lies, had returned with a vengeance. "Divorce suits you," I joked as I sat down across from her. She smirked, stirring her tea. "It's amazing what dropping a dead weight can do for your posture." We talked about the kids, about work, about the strange relief that came with finally stepping out from under the shadow of betrayal. It was comforting to share the space with someone who understood exactly what I'd been through. "What about Vanessa?" she asked eventually, her tone cautious. "Is she, I don't know, apologetic?" I shook my head. "She's too busy feeling sorry for herself to apologize. She keeps trying to make it about the kids, like I'm the villain for keeping them here. But I'm not bending on that." Rachel nodded. "Good. They need stability right now, not more chaos." By the time I got home, the kids were in the backyard, kicking a soccer ball around. Ethan was trying to teach Oliver some basic moves, while Hannah stood to the side, watching with her arms crossed. I joined them, feeling a twinge of hope as Ethan passed me the ball without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. The house was quieter without Vanessa, but it also felt lighter, like I could finally breathe again. I threw myself into being there for the kids, helping Ethan with his drills, attending every one of Hannah's games, and building Lego cities with Oliver on the weekends. Ethan still had his moments of anger, but they became less frequent. One night, after his team won a big game, he hugged me tightly and said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." The words were simple, but they felt like a breakthrough. Hannah surprised me one evening by asking if I could help her practice for her recital. She had always been fiercely independent, so her request caught me off guard. But as I watched her play, her fingers moving deftly over the keys, I realized it was her way of reaching out. Oliver remained my shadow, always eager to show me his latest creations or ask for help with a particularly tricky design. His innocence was a reminder of what I was fighting for, a future where my kids could grow up without the weight of their parents' mistakes. As for Vanessa, her visits grew less frequent. She seemed to be drifting, unsure of her place in a life she no longer controlled. She tried reaching out a few times, asking if we could talk, but I always kept the conversations brief and focused on logistics. There was nothing left to say. One afternoon, while going through some old boxes in the garage, I found the mug Ethan had given me years ago. "World's best, Dad." I held it in my hands, turning it over slowly, the words feeling less like a mockery and more like a challenge. I wasn't perfect, and I'd made my share of mistakes, but I'd fight every day to be the father my kids deserved. They were my anchor, my purpose, and no amount of betrayal could take that away. The hardest part of my life was over. Now, it was time to rebuild. For them. For me. For a future free from lies. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again, or at least a version of normal I could accept. The chaos Vanessa had left behind started to fade, replaced by a sense of calm I hadn't realized I was missing. The kids adapted in their own ways, each finding their rhythm in this new life. Ethan was thriving in soccer, his natural leadership skills earning him the position of team captain. His anger toward me had softened, though it hadn't entirely disappeared. One evening, after a particularly intense practice, he lingered in the kitchen while I cleaned up. "Do you think Mom will come to the next game?" he asked, not looking at me. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter. "I'm not sure, buddy, but if she doesn't, I'll be there. Always." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know you will." It wasn't an apology, but it felt close enough. Hannah found solace in her music, spending hours at the piano. Her teacher called her a prodigy, though she brushed off the praise with a shrug. One night, after her recital, she sat next to me on the couch, still in her dress, her hair tied back in a messy bun. "Do you think things will ever go back to the way they were?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "No," I admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Sometimes moving forward is better than looking back." She rested her head on my shoulder, and I felt a flicker of hope. Oliver, ever the curious one, had taken to asking questions about everything. He built intricate Lego creations and explained them to me as if I were his apprentice. "This is the support beam," he'd say, pointing to a piece. "Without it, the whole thing falls apart." It felt like a metaphor I wasn't ready to unpack. Vanessa's visits became sporadic. She came by for birthdays and holidays, but stayed on the periphery, as though she didn't know where she belonged anymore. The kids welcomed her with a mix of excitement and reservation, a sign that they were learning to set their own boundaries. One day, she pulled me aside after dropping the kids off. "Mark," she began, her voice hesitant, I want to say I'm sorry." I crossed my arms, keeping my tone neutral. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her eyes darting to the floor. "For lying, for hurting you, for what it's done to the kids." Her words were the closest thing to accountability I'd heard from her since it all began. But they didn't carry the weight they might have months ago. "I appreciate that," I said simply. "But the damage is done, Vanessa. I've moved on, and you should too." She nodded, blinking back tears. "I just hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer her, at least not yet. Maybe not ever. Eric's story ended more predictably. Rachel finalized their divorce and took full custody of their kids, leaving him with little more than his name. He tried reaching out to Vanessa, but whatever future they had imagined was long gone. The last I heard, he was working a low-paying job in another state, far removed from the life he once flaunted. For me, rebuilding became a daily practice. I sold the house and moved the kids to a smaller but cozier place on the other side of town. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, a clean slate. I poured myself into work, expanding my company and finding purpose in something I could control. One evening, as I sat in my new office reviewing a proposal, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Dinner next week? I owe you a bottle of wine for surviving all this." I smiled and replied, "You're on." It wasn't romantic, at least, not yet, but it was nice to have someone who understood the weight of what I'd been through. The kids flourished in ways I hadn't expected. Ethan led his team to a championship and started talking about playing in college. Hannah began composing her own music, her confidence growing with each new piece. And Oliver, my quiet builder, won a regional contest for an engineering project he designed. On the day of Oliver's awards ceremony, the three of us stood together in the audience, clapping as he walked onto the stage. Ethan leaned over and whispered, "He's gonna be a genius, isn't he?" "He already is," I replied, pride swelling in my chest. Later that night, as I tucked Oliver into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, questioning eyes. "Do you think Mom is proud of me too?" "Of course she is," I said, stroking his hair. "How could she not be?" He smiled, satisfied with the answer, and drifted off to sleep. As I stood in the doorway, watching him breathe softly, I realized that this was enough. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger. It had all led me here, to this life I was rebuilding piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, but it was real.